Welcome to Lesson 1 of our two-quarter series on the book of Genesis. I hope you're looking forward to this study. I have been looking forward to this study for quite some time, but I've also been a little bit anxious about this study because I and every other teacher that follows me are going to face the same challenge of how do we take all of the content that we have and squeeze it into a 45-minute lesson. So we're going to have to take one of two approaches. We're either going to take a broad stroke with the content that we have and cover the big topics, or we're going to have to choose to deep dive into selected topics. And each teacher will choose their approach. But I think the takeaway is that regardless of the approach that we take as teachers, this is just the starting point for you as a student. This should be an introduction to the material that you would study that week. And I encourage you to take that approach. This is an introduction. And then spend your time during the week and study to really sink into and settle into the text that we've studied. I'm going to do the first 3 chapters of Genesis in 2 different lessons. And you could easily spend an entire quarter on the first 3 chapters of Genesis. And that would be so much fun. But we're going to do it in 2 lessons. So let's go. The first question that we're going to ask ourselves is, why? It's part of our human condition that we were almost designed to be asking why. We've been doing it almost since birth. And if you're a parent of a toddler, you know that that question why comes out of your child's mouth almost constantly. Dad, why does the moon look red tonight? Daddy, why do caterpillars have so many legs? Daddy, why don't you have hair on the top of your head? There are an infinite number of why questions that our toddlers seem to come with. And the question we should ask is, why should we spend almost half a year, 2 quarters, of our valuable Sunday morning class time studying Genesis? Why should we view that class time as introductory and then go home and dig in with our personal study? Isn't this just ancient history? Well, it is ancient history. But for us, Christians, it's not just ancient history. Genesis beckons those of us to ask, why? Why does the universe work the way it does? Why does this planet we call home work the way it does? Why are humans the way that we are? And why do we have so much trouble getting along? Is the universe designed as it appears to be? And if the universe is designed, who is the designer? Can I know the designer? What is the meaning of life? Now, if you never ask these type of why questions, then Genesis is just ancient history. Otherwise, Genesis is written to force me to make choices. Do I take it seriously, or is it just entertaining literature? And if I take it seriously, how does my worldview influence my reading? And if I take it seriously, how does my reading influence my worldview? Do I really need a worldview to read Genesis? And the answer is yes. And you have one, whether you want to admit it or not. So before we dig into Genesis and start with chapter 1, we must identify our worldview. And this is the process that starts the divisions for which this lesson is titled Divisions Lesson 1. Some divisions are constructive. God divides things in His act of creation according to a biblical worldview. Some divisions can create conflict, and Genesis can create conflict. Some divisions are necessary, and some divisions are man-made. And the story of Genesis is a story of divisions, but also a story of unity. And it can be a paradox. We'll start by dividing worldviews, so you know where I'm coming from as I learn from Genesis, and as we try to get on the same page as we study together this magnificent book. At the top of the worldview chart, there are two big camps, the naturalism camp and the creationism camp. And the question is, do you believe the universe is all that there is? Do you believe the universe had a beginning? And if you believe the universe had a beginning, do you think it sprang into being spontaneously? Or do you believe that there is or was a designer creator? Well, I have a specific point of view, and I imagine you have a specific point of view. But the inspired Apostle Paul had a very specific point of view on this topic. And it turns out that he created a cornerstone anchor point for a Christian worldview in Romans chapter 1. Paul would say that naturalism is really just the worship of nature rather than the worship of the creator of nature. And remember that the word worship means worthship, that you're ascribing value to something. And so if you worship nature, you're ascribing ultimate value to the universe, to nature, as the end-all, be-all. Naturalism, as a philosophy, ascribes ultimate value to the universe, and it demotes all other forms, including human life, under the universe and nature. Paul says that naturalism is actually a lie. Almost all atheists, by definition, a meaning not theists, and most agnostics would fall in this camp of saying the universe is all that there is. But I believe actually modern science is increasingly in conflict with this view that the universe is all there is and without beginning. I'm not a believer in naturalism, and I believe there are very compelling reasons for you to consider alternatives. So let's follow Paul down his worldview train of thought. And if you believe that the universe had a beginning, then you are probably either a deist or a theist. Deists essentially believe in a set it and forget it approach, in which the designer sets everything in motion and then nature took over. Deism is a comfortable place for moderns to land if they believe that there was a beginning. But it seems to me that if you believe there's a beginning and a mind was involved in creating that beginning, then you might want to know something about that mind. If there's a supreme being, I want to know more about the supreme being. And where would I go to find out more about the supreme being? It's probably going to lead me as a seeker to investigate various religions to see if any of them point toward the supreme being. The reality is that most of our human experience has centered around religions that are theistic. Most of those religions, especially those at the time that Genesis was written and that Paul wrote the book of Romans, were polytheistic in nature. And they tended to derive their gods from nature and aspects of nature or events within nature. Moses and the Israelites emerge in recorded history in a cultural context that's very polytheistic. The Sumerians, the Mesopotamians, the Canaanites, and certainly the Egyptians all had polytheistic religions to explain the world and the cosmos around them. And remember that the Israelites had spent 400 years immersed in this culture of polytheism that enshrined the sun as the primary god, Ra, in their polytheistic religion, in their pantheon. And Paul speaks directly to polytheism in his worldview train of thought. Paul has a strong point of view on nature-based polytheistic religions, which were basically all of the competing religions with Judaism and Christianity from the time of Moses to the first century biblical context that Paul wrote within. And ironically, if you really think about it, this type of theism really just circles back to be worship of nature. Man worships an object, which represents an element of nature, which equals man worshiping nature. Paul points out here in the scripture that those polytheistic nature worshipers, while claiming to be wise, became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things, which is an accurate description of these polytheistic religions and the idols that represented these gods that existed within nature. I'm not aware of a polytheistic religion that has a pantheon existing before the creation of the universe. There may be one, but I do know that a biblical worldview clearly identifies that creator, and we know his name. Finally, a verse from Genesis. Remember that Moses went to school in Egypt as a royal, and so he knew how his message that he's delivering in this very first chapter of Genesis would be received by almost everyone who heard it. Even the Israelites left Egypt loaded down with idols, and they created a big one to worship while Moses was up on the mountain. And so this statement by itself is a stunning proposition for Moses to make to his people and to the cultures around them. The story Moses is telling, especially in the first 3 chapters, is very unique in ancient literature. There were other religions that included creation accounts and flood accounts that would be a natural outgrowth of oral tradition passed down about these actual events, but they're so different than the way that Moses tells the real story. The difference between Genesis and these myths is that Moses did not derive his account from oral tradition. He received these facts directly from God. Moses was a special prophet with unique interactions with God, resulting in unique revelation. He was appointed for this purpose, for this moment in time. You may remember that God even allowed Moses to view as much of God's glory as Moses could handle. And it's possible, and I'm not saying that it's true, but it's possible that God provided a front row seat to the actual movie, similar to the visions that he provided to Ezekiel, similar to the visions he provided to John. And if we had a chance to see the actual creation movie, would we do any better than Moses in trying to describe it? Would we do any better than Ezekiel trying to describe his vision of God in heaven, or John of his vision of God in heaven? Or would we struggle to try to put into words the amazing visions that we are seeing? Whatever Moses saw or was told by God, the first 3 chapters of Genesis are very intentional in what they tell us. And they're likely intentional about what they don't tell us. A biblical worldview within this category of theism is summed up here. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Orthodox Christian and Jewish and even Islamic assumption is that Genesis is an inspired account of actual historic events. It begins with the creation of the universe by a single supreme creator outside of our space-time reality. And New Testament inspired writers affirm the biblical worldview. The Hebrew writer implies that creation was created from nothing, that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. And so the Creator started from scratch. John in Revelation, as he's seeing the vision of heaven for the first time in chapter 4, has this amazing tribute to the Creator that ends by saying, "Worthy, O you, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power. For you created all things, and by your will they existed and were created." Acknowledging God as the creator of the universe inspires humility and awe and worship of the Creator and not the created. And ultimately, all knees will bow to the Creator. And then in John chapter 1, John, the same John that saw the vision of Revelation, completes the biblical worldview and creates the Christian worldview in the process, as we discover more about the supreme being, including why this being refers to himself in the plural in this beginning chapter. The story of Genesis is the first supreme intervention by our Creator, and it's a 3-act account: creation, formation, creation, and rest. The story of Jesus is the second supreme intervention by our Creator, and it's a 3-act account: incarnation, redemption through the cross, and ascension to the throne. Genesis tells us why the first necessitates the second. The Christian worldview has no room for a deist philosophy. Our Creator Savior continues to intervene and holds everything together for our benefit. And this places believers into a peaceful relationship with God and with one another. Paul delivers the same Moses message to his polytheistic Greek audience on the Areopagus. He says this is not a deist type God, and our God does not exist within a pantheon. He says he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward Him and find Him. Yet He is actually not far from each of us. For in Him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we indeed are His offspring. We have a personal, theist, supreme being God that not only created us but cares for us, and it empowers us to live and creates relationship for us to be in with Him and with our fellow believers. So going back to Romans 1, Paul is going to anchor his Christian worldview on evidence, not myth or tradition. You see, our Creator gave us this inexhaustible tendency to ask why. He created us this way. It shows up, as I said, almost from birth. And He gave us the ability to find answers. He gave us a mind to ask the question and then search for the answers and have the ability to find the answers. And then He created a universe of which every aspect witnesses and testifies to the attributes and the activities of the Creator. Paul says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For His invisible attributes, namely His eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse." The more we search, the more we find. It's like peeling an infinite onion. The more we peel, the more layers that we discover. The actual scientific facts we learn will always align with biblical truth. Science and Christianity are not enemies, and conflicts are either errors in scientific interpretation or they're errors in biblical interpretation. Probably the most famous example is the idea of fixed earth theory. At one point, science thought that the earth was the center of everything and that the planetary bodies and the sun rotated around the earth. And religion was aligned with that view. And there were some good scriptures that would imply that that could be true, talking about the foundations of the earth and the earth being unmovable. Scriptures that were intended to remind us of our frailty compared to the object that is the most stable in our existence. But it doesn't necessitate a fixed earth theory. And so once the idea of a heliocentric system started to be clearly perceived, for many it created a faith crisis, but it was an unnecessary crisis because the reality of our solar system aligns perfectly with the creation account. So, we have to learn a lesson. As soon as things are clearly perceived, the way that we observe them in nature, we have to question our worldview. We have to look at what our beliefs are. We have to look back at Scripture, and we have to say, how do we align the conflict? How do we align science with what the Bible says is true? And we have to determine what's true and what is mere interpretation. So let's not get in our own way when searching for God's glory in every corner of His creation. I think you could sort of translate Paul's worldview into kind of a prime directive, a primary motive for our own worldview, which is first, ask why a lot. God would say, go for it. Knock your socks off. The more questions you ask, the more answers I'll provide, and spawn exponentially more questions for you to ask. We will never run out of questions before God runs out of answers if we keep our eyes open. Christianity is unique in that it demands the faithful to always challenge our worldview. Our faith will stand up to every challenge, and in the end, all science disciplines will testify to God's glory. And we're finding that to be true. Whether it's physics or astrophysics, or whether it's medicine, biology, especially microbiology, astronomy, all the scientific disciplines ultimately point to a designer, and we know a designer that we can have relationship with. The presence of DNA, the mathematics that work within our universe, the things that have to be true, the unbelievably unlikely events that have to be true for life to exist on this planet. All of these things testify to our Creator. The question is, what does our worldview, our Christian worldview, say about this universe that God created for us? Now we have to go to Genesis chapter 1. As we move into Genesis chapter 1, my desire is that we move from divisions to unity, that we move from talking about naturalism versus creationism, deism versus theism, polytheism versus monotheism, biblical worldview, Christian worldview, into within a Christian worldview, what unifies us. There are takeaways from the creation account that are unifying and powerful for defending our faith. But there are also many rabbit trails that have been built up over the centuries that can get us wrapped around the axle. This is an image that I love. It shows a clear depiction of somebody who's wrapped around, in this case, a PTO shaft. This is like kind of label that you would see on a tractor or a tractor implement or in a production facility that if you put your hand in the wrong place, fingers can get chopped off, or your arm in the wrong place, it can get broken, or in this case, you get too close to a spinning PTO shaft and you can be turned into a pretzel. Just a little side story. One time I was preaching a sermon about not sweating the details that are optional and getting wrapped around the axle unnecessarily. And after the lesson, after church was over, this sweet young man came up and he said, "You know that's not an axle, that was a PTO shaft." So for all the farmers out there, yes, it's a PTO shaft. But the visual is just something you can't pass up. The real risk is that our spirited debates that we have over Genesis chapter 1, over young earth or old earth, and the exact nature of the creation days and relativity of time, within this account, and an expanding universe, and how to reconcile fossil records, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, can, if we're not careful, impair the gospel message included in chapter 1. Not that we should discourage spirited debate. God gave us a spirit of inquiry to ask why. However, especially with outsiders, seekers, the creation account has a message that is powerful and redemptive. We need to major in the majors and be ready to present the true distinctive message of the first 3 chapters of Genesis in the same life-changing way that Moses received it and Moses delivered it. With so little time to cover an entire chapter, I'm going to largely skip all the fun rabbit trails and try to stay big picture and gospel message oriented and not get wrapped around the axle. Earlier I mentioned a 3-act play. And I use that word play because this is a dramatic account. It's a theatrical account, but it is narrative, historical account. It's just great storytelling. And the story speaks to progression, and it speaks to intentional sequence. It goes from broader to narrower and has an indication of building sequentially to a climax, just like a great movie. As we read these verses, imagine that Moses had that front row seat to the majesty of God's creative process. And he's putting into words, relatively few words, a written image of what he saw. Remember that God is revealing something about the nature of our universe, our solar system, the earth, life, and humans, and that his audience is primarily a polytheistic culture that worships that creation. The statement here is our God is distinct and outside creation and not contained within it. The verse is, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and the darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. God's first act is to establish the beginning with the creation of the universe containing space, energy, and matter, heavens and earth. The matter, earth, was without form and void, just as science would predict. After this creative act, and some amount of time, which is not described, formation is required. And during this time, our triune God, God the Father, God the Son, God the Spirit, was hovering over what Moses describes as waters. After some undisclosed amount of time, God is ready to move the focus to a special system and a planet in a corner of this universe to form our reality. The word creation, the Hebrew word for creation, is used in verse 1. It's followed by a succession of maids, the Hebrew word for maid, and then 2 more instances of the word creation. Creation regarding animal life on day 5, and creation of human life on the 6th day. Day 1. And it's interesting that the first 5 days are referred to in the Hebrew text as day 1, day 2, day 3, without the indefinite article, and then the 6th day, and the 7th day have the definite article. So if you were to read it literally, you would say, day 1, God makes something, right? He made in our corner of the universe our perception of light and dark, night and day, which is a simple explanation for a solar system that we've confirmed with scientific observation, that there's a star and a rotating planet that revolves around the star, and it creates light and dark in the form of what we experience as a day, our most basic human experience. Day, night, day, night. And the experience we have is the experience you would expect us to have, knowing what we know about the solar system. this creation on day one is that fundamental human experience. We move to day two, and there's lots of water, which is, I think, the best Moses can do with what he saw or what he was told. It probably references the formation of seas across the entire planet with a dense cloud cover high in the atmosphere with a space in the middle that we call the troposphere. However, it could be much more expansive, and it could refer to a molten planet with an atmosphere and solar energy above that, from Moses' perspective, look like waters. It sure would be nice to see the video and to really see what Moses saw. But the main point of day two is that a planet that we would recognize as being formed, that God is making it into a place that's very, very special. Day three is a special day. There's two of them like it. 2 days in which it required God to speak 2 words in order to form what is being formed. The first word that God speaks is to create oceans and dry land, to gather the seas together distinctively and have dry land, continent or continents, rise. And this is a good planet. God says it was good, but it was a lifeless planet. In order for life to come to this lifeless planet, a second word needs to be spoken. And I think God was really intentional about making this distinction, anticipating probably our modern hand-wringing over how life could spring from inert matter, and we have no valid explanation other than God speaking 2 words within day 3. The second formation word that God speaks is required to bring life to the continents in the form of vegetation. Perhaps God anticipated this difficulty that we have now, but life did not come into existence without that second word from God. And so vegetative life is made and reproduction is initiated, leading to diversity of the plant species. And it's a really good thing that there's light so that photosynthesis works, which leads us to the biggest stumbling block in the creation account, one of the wrapped around the axle places. And so this is one rabbit trail that I'm going to entertain because we need to be ready to deal with this stumbling block. The question that we're forced to ask about day 4 is that did God form the sun, moon, and stars after making what would seem to be the solar system, light, dark, day, night, on day 1? And do we need to die on this hill? Because for a lot of people, this sounds very implausible, that you would have day and night, and you would have light and dark without the sun, the moon, and the stars being created. It also does not follow what we would observe from science about the progression of the way that the universe and our solar system came into being. Possibly this is a literal sequence, and God could have done whatever God wanted to do, and he could have provided another source of light for photosynthesis. But it's also possible that if we look into the Hebrew text and understand the context of why Moses was writing what he was writing, that we may come to another conclusion. There may be other possibilities. I think there are at least 2. One is that what God is saying is that the celestial bodies were revealed to the planet at a time when they need to be revealed, that photosynthesis need to occur, and so direct sunlight and a period of light and dark were necessary for life, vegetative life, to thrive. And I think that's possible. But I also think when you look at that Hebrew word for made, it's a very flexible word. It's a flexible word like the word used for day, actually. And it can be translated as formed, completed, matured, or appointed. Perhaps these celestial bodies were revealed to the planet and facilitated the life that was created in day 3. But I think it's more likely that here in day 4, the idea of appointing may be reflected here. These previously created celestial bodies, the stars, the moon, the sun, They're in this day appointed to their specific formal role. And these roles, they're supporting roles, not worship roles. God appoints the celestial bodies to roles that support life on this planet that he made in scene 3 and is going to continue to make in scenes 5 and 6. And once again, remember the context. What lie is God confronting through Moses? Not the nature-worshiping roles of the competitive worldviews. And remember, the original audience for Moses, this sermon that he's going to deliver on creation, probably still had raw idols in their tent. They still had that notion of the sun being something that should be worshiped. And so day 4 confronts that directly and says, the sun is not a god, the moon is not a god, the stars are not gods, constellations are not gods. In fact, this account moves the status of these celestial bodies down to be servants of life, not sources of worship. It's very intentional language that the Egyptians and the Canaanites are going to hear. It actually says that the sun is a lamp, right? Not a god, it's just a lamp. Fuel-burning lamp, actually. And it says the moon is a dim lamp, and actually it's just a mirror. We know that to be true. They're not gods. The stars, constellations are not gods, but they serve a purpose. They mark the seasons. They support navigation. They create the cycles and the boundaries that we observe and live within. And they center our curiosity on the Creator. They have a role to perform. And I think what God is saying here is that this is the time that that role became important because life is coming to the planet. And we need to understand the role of these bodies, what they are and what they're not. So if you take this appointing view, then the following scenes naturally follow the appointment of the solar system to support more complex life on the planet and the creation of the 3 formation days, the appointing day, and then 3 more formation days with a final act of creation. It sounds very symmetric. 3, 1, 3. It sounds very intentional. Design, 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 progression, sequence. And it sounds very biblical from a numerology perspective. 3, 1, 3. I'll leave that with you. But I think it's possible to walk through this account and not trip over that stumbling block. Day 5. God creates, not made, God creates animal life, beginning in the seas and then proceeding to the sky, which is consistent with the fossil record, which indicate progression from sea creatures to feathered creatures and then to reptiles and mammals. But I think God's saying something about animal life here by using the word create, that there's something different about animal life compared to plant life, which required a creation word from God, not a make word from God. And does that align with our experience? Is our perception of animal life different than plant life? Do the animals that we see in nature have spirit? Mine do. They're very spirited. One of the reasons I think that we're attracted to animals is because we share something about our natures, that we have spirit within us that's different than the life that we see growing out of the ground. So they're fundamentally different. But then in some ways they're actually the same because reproduction is initiated, leading to a diversity of the species. And then we come to day 6, the most important day. And it's another one of those special days where God speaks twice, just like day 3. The last day of the first 3, the last day of the second 3. On the 6th day, remember the definite articles there, the 6th day, land animals are made to join the swimming and flying members of the animal kingdom. See the account. And God saw that it was good. But there's something missing in day 6 that's required to move from good to very good. And so the most verbose part of the story that Moses is going to tell us has to do with the ultimate creation act for God. Similar to day 3, emphasizes the distinctive formation of plant life as compared to the making of the continents, the making of dry land. Creative word is required. Day 6 emphasizes the distinctive creation of humans after the creation of animal life and the formation of land animals. The second use of the word creation since verse 1, it's used 3 times, indicates that we are both formed and created, that we're made and created. And perhaps God anticipated the modern debate over human linkage to other animals. Because we may share 98% of our DNA with chimps, but that doesn't mean that chimps are 98% human. We are very different. And there's something about our nature which is formed and also created. And the reality, the central reality of human existence is that we are the only creation made in God's image. The universe and nature reflect God's glory, but human beings have the image of God embedded within us. This means, and this is so important, this means that human beings have inherent value that cannot be diminished by man. Human value is enshrined by God in our very creation, our very essence. And it's not a matter of DNA. As powerful as DNA is, as amazing as these computer systems within our cells that use the DNA source code to create us and define how we look and who we are, it's not a matter of DNA. It's something much more distinctive. It's certainly an eternal soul, probably the most distinctive thing about humans, but it's also free will, that we don't act according to instinct alone. We act according to our ability to make choices, good choices, bad choices. And the difference between a good choice and a bad choice comes from a moral compass that we seem to be built with. That God says, you know the difference between right and wrong. I built it inside you to know. And then we have this insatiable curiosity that no other animal has. We ask the question, why? And we search for answers. This is the climax to the story. And when I use the word story, it doesn't imply allegory. This is a narrative, historical account, but it's also really good storytelling. The bottom line, the opening chapter of the Bible tells us that an infinite and omnipotent God created a universe in a formation progress, a progression that resulted in his ultimate creation, us. Some people find the notion that we are at the center of attention of a God capable of creating the universe that we can observe. They find that absurd. You know, the universe could wipe us out in a million different ways, but the universe doesn't have the capacity to care about us at all. But we have the capacity to care about the universe, and that comes from God, who cares immensely for his universe, especially those he created at the center of it. He works to hold it together for our benefit. It's so important to God for you to know how special you are in this universe that he created, that he's going to dedicate the first chapter of his written communication to all of us to tell you, you are special. God's final act of creation puts an exclamation point on how special you are. And he invites you to relish that and to live in that reality. And he also invites us into a shared experience. It's tempting to blow past day 7 and say, day 7 is the day of rest. But we want to skip over this because it's really important. God's creative work is complete, but he's not done working. Jesus said so. God continues to work. Jesus continues to work. Day 7, the 7th day, God invites us to share in his experience in a way that connects us to him. The natural cycle to human existence has always been based on a lunar system, more or less. 28 days with a new moon and a full moon. Our current calendar makes adjustments to accommodate 365.25 days, so we get a leap year every 4 years, and also 2 Caesars that wanted months named after them. But the cultures that lived around the Israelites tended to focus on that lunar calendar, and that these lunar events, new moon, full moon, were times for celebration, for festivals, for rest. God called his people that were to be a testimony to him, into a primary cycle that wasn't based on the moon. It was based on 7 days in a week. The Hebrew life cycle of 7 days fitted within that lunar calendar, but it was intended to point back to God. In God's experience, not nature and a lunar calendar and a new moon and a full moon. Everyone around the Israelites worked 7 days a week until a festival came along and they had a chance to rest or party. God had a practical purpose for initiating the Sabbath day. Foremost, frequently create an opportunity for believers to stop and meditate and ask the questions, why? Every week, an opportunity to stop and meditate. Jesus said the Sabbath was created for man, and that man was not created for the Sabbath. It was created for our benefit, this notion. And we need to pay attention to this truth. We don't observe the Sabbath day for religious reasons, but we should not ignore the underlying truth inherent in the Sabbath. Sometimes, especially now, we tend to run so fast and so hard that we tend to miss the forest for the trees. God did not need physical rest from the work that he did during the creation account like we do every night, not just once a week. So he's not talking about physical rest, he's talking about a spiritual rest. We need that today. God settled into the reality that he created so he could work with us and be in relationship with us. And he invites us to settle into that same reality. So let's not miss that opportunity. And if you want to know more about that, go to Hebrews chapter 4, because it has a lot to say about how we can participate in God's rest and also continue to work with him. But let's not run so fast that we miss the opportunity. So what are the truths that we get from Genesis chapter 1? God exists. God is the eternal creator. God is distinct from his creation. Our God is personal. God is a fellowship, inherently. God has a goal in his creation. God creates by his word. God is the source of all light. Physical light, spiritual light, intelligent light. God's creation is good, very good. And this is the most important point. God created us in his image, and he invites us to share in his experience. And what an amazing revelation that is. What a stunning proposition that this first chapter of our Bible presents to us. I made an acknowledgement. These truths were lifted almost completely from a book from John C. Lennox called The 7 Days That Divide the World, the beginning according to Genesis and science. This is the book. If you're inclined to dive deep into the Genesis creation account and think about how science and the Bible can be aligned and what are the different possibilities, I can recommend this book. It's the best that I've found when really trying to open your mind to what is science telling us about God? What can we observe in nature that points back to God? John does a great job. 7 days to divide the world. For our next lesson, read Genesis 2 and 3. And I'd recommend you go back to Genesis 1 and read and meditate on that as well. But next lesson, we're going to talk about bliss and tragedy, because our human story begins.